This is a tale about Swavesey, a village nestling on the edges of the Cambridgeshire fenlands by the river Great Ouse. It hides an intriguing historical mystery concerning its public houses. Over the last 2 centuries, the village has had at least 24 public houses, most of them open at various times in the 19th century. At this time, there was about 1 public house for every 15 households. Now, all but 1 have disappeared.
So he was obviously the owner of it.
Yes. To William Brown's.
Oh, I see, yes.
Farmer and historian John Shepperson has spent many years researching the Swavesey pubs and the reasons for their proliferation and ultimate demise. His celebrated pub walk takes us from the Trinity Foot by the A14 to the north end of the village, stopping at the last survivor, the White Horse Inn in the Market Square. Our journey starts outside the main village, on the A14, once an ancient Roman road. This was the site of the new inn, later renamed the Trinity Foot.
In 1838, Martin Osborne, owner of the Broadway brewery St Ives, was allotted 6 acres of land on the corner of Swavesey Road and the A14. On this land he built the new inn, public house. When it opened originally, it would have been trying to cater for the trade of people travelling on horse and carts and people travelling from village to village. My father told me that when he was young, you would see the horses and carts, and you would see ponies and traps, and you would see people walking along the road. On a Sunday, if you went up there, you hardly ever saw anybody on the road other than families walking between villages. You'd have somebody, probably a family in Lowell, who were walking down to Swavesey to see their family in Swavesey. And this sort of thing was about the only people on the road at that time when he was young. I mean, my grandfather, he lived at Fenstanton. He was a bricklayer, and he used to walk from Fenstanton to Cambridge to lay bricks. He used to do a day's brickwork. I've heard father say that he used to get into Cambridge at 6 o'clock, and he'd then do a day's work, lay 1,000 bricks, and then after 5 o'clock he would walk back home again.
The longevity of the new inn is doubtless due to its strategic position on one of the county's major highways. The new inn has seen the birth of the motor car, and the rest, as they say, is history.
By 1886, Richard Topper and his family were living there. One day, Richard's son, Dick, and my father were watching the Boxworth roadman filling holes with wood he had cut from the roadside spinney. The roadman said, "My boys, in a few years' time you will see horseless carriages using this road." They laughed at him. About 2 years after this incident, Dick and my father saw for the first time a man with a red flag walking in front of a car travelling along the road. My father never forgot this incident, and 70 years later, as I was driving along the A14, he said, "Whatever would the Boxworth roadman say if he could see so many cars using this road today?" Later, and at that time, the arrangements she had with the local policeman, because people weren't allowed to drink while on duty. So she had an arrangement with the local policeman that when he was on his rounds, doing his patrols, he used to call in at the new inn, and Mrs. Cannon would put a pint of beer in the pump at the end of the house, so that he could collect it as he went by and continued on his rounds, his beat actually, I suppose you'd call it.
In 1960, the new inn was sold to Whitbreads. They demolished the coach house and stable, modernised the house, added an extension for catering, and renamed it the Trinity Foot. The painting on the sign showed Trinity College students with their dogs. Bob and Irene Norman became the tenants, followed by John and Brenda Mole.
The first year, we moved 1981. In December 1981, the 13th of December, we had the snow in. And the pub was full all Sunday night, and nobody paid anything at all. We just fed about 60, 70 people on the Sunday night, because the snow drifted. The wind had blown the snow off the field and drifted a couple of cars, and we had one hell of a night. And from then on, and those 100 people that never knew me from Adams in the first place kept coming back, bringing friends and coming back. And on the Tuesday, after the Sunday, it was our silver wedding. And most of them came back again and collected for us and had some silver wine stand and silver jug. And we lived on that for years.
The Trinity Foot was a very popular inn during this period, but in 2009 it closed its doors for the last time. It now stands empty.
I can't see that ever being anything now. It's got to be rebuilt because it's been stripped out. There's no piping, no copper, no nothing, no sinks. And the floors have got damp, they're all turned up. The roof must have leaked because that was leaking a bit before I come away. And the walls are taking damp in. Except the bottom wall, I think in the restaurant down the bottom, that's probably not damp because that's got about 10 rolls of wallpaper on it. Where I used to wallpaper that up. It stopped it for quite a while, the damp coming through, but no, it's got to be rebuilt. We'll never do it.
About half a mile north of the A14, we come to the edge of the village of Swavesey itself, and to the first of our village pubs, the old and new Red Lions.
Before the enclosure in 1838, the road at Boxworth End widened out into a green. Branching out on the west side of the green was a track to Radford's Mill called Cox Street. Built on the side of the track was a public house called the Red Lion. It was ideally placed as a stopping place for farm labourers with loads of corn on their way to the mill.
In 1838, the Enclosure Act repositioned the main road, sidelining the old Red Lion public house.
At this end of the village there was a green, an area of wasteland called a green, and after the enclosure this was divided up between the adjoining properties, and where this house stands there was just a small piece of land which was added to the adjoining property, and this house was actually built on the edge of this piece of land, so that it was on the edge of the new road that leads through to the Trinity Foot, the road that we call Buckingway Road today. The design of the new house was identical to the old one. On completion, the alcohol licence was transferred from the first Red Lion to the second Red Lion. In July 1910, an amusing newspaper report about an incident at the Red Lion was in the local paper. It said, "Mrs. Garner, the landlord's wife, recently had a surprise. Whilst engaged in the house at work, at the back of the house, she thought she heard a crowd of customers in the tap room. On hurrying through, she found that the room full of sheep. They had found their way in through the open front door." In 1912, the Red Lion licence was surrendered, and Huntingdon Brewery put the house up for sale. For the next 100 years, the house has been part of Boxworth End Farm. We're actually sitting in the tap room of the Red Lion. This is the house where I was born and where I'm still living today. The first Black Bull was a thatched house set back from the road. In 1867, the house and 3 cottages adjoining were burnt down. The public house and the cottages were then rebuilt nearer the road. Living at the Black Bull in 1904 was David Parish. beer retailer and cycle agent, and his family. A photograph of the house, taken about that time, shows a cycle wheel advertising the agency, fitted on the wall of the house, and a clock fitted on the public house signpost. In 1920, the public house closed and was sold to David. In a large workshop built behind the house, David's sons ran an engineering business, making and repairing agricultural machines and cars. In 1908, David and his sons were also threshing contractors. In the workshop, Frank made wireless, the early name for a radio. When a wireless became popular in the home, Frank set up in business charging the wireless accumulators. When collecting an accumulator, he would take it off charge, stand it on his bench, add a little distilled water to the cells, and he would say in his squeaky voice, "Wait a few minutes while I add a little tea." In the early 1930s, Frank made the first television in the village. Local would visit his workshop of an evening and group round to watch the small flickering picture it produced.
64 Boxworth End is on the site of the Rose and Crown Inn. It was recorded in licensing records in 1765 and was probably a public house for many years before that. In the 19th century, many people were part-time publicans, supplementing their income with a variety of jobs.
By 1880, Robert and Eliza Elwood combined the operation of publican with that of sausage skin cleaners. The last publican was Edward Gleaves, who was a poultry farmer.
The original building was pulled down in 1909, replaced with the present house built by William Daisley. All that remains of the pub is the name of the road. The prominent house, standing at number 34 Boxworth End, is still named the Wheatsheaf.
The Wheatsheaf public house, once again, that was built on part of what was the Great Green prior to the enclosure in 1840. That area of land was called the Great Green, and the track across the green was made into the road as we know it today, and the public house was actually built on the edge of the road, in other words on the green, in a similar way as to the Red Lion was built on the edge of the road at roughly the same time.
One of the reasons for the large number of public houses in 19th century villages would probably have been because most houses and cottages were too small to hold many people. There would have been few, if any, civic buildings in the villages, and many events and meetings would have taken place in public houses. We will see how many of the Swavesey pubs were used for land sales, coroners' inquests and committee meetings. The Wheatsheaf was a meeting point for the Wheatsheaf Lodge of the Ancient Shepherds, a friendly society.
Members helped somebody in need. If somebody was ill, they helped them if they were unable to earn anything, you see, and if they were ill, they helped them with any illness expenses and things like that. In 1896, the Wheatsheaf closed as a public house and was sold as a private house. Then they moved to the Cricketers in the High Street. They were at the Cricketers for about 2 or 3 years until that closed, and then they moved to the George and Dragon, and then they moved over the road to the White Wolf when the George and Dragon closed.
The Green Man at the beginning of Boxworth End was one of the oldest public houses in the village, listed as fully licensed in 1820. In those days it stood on the side of the Great Green.
And in 1909 it was actually sold, closed as a public house and sold in 1909 to a Mr. Daisley. And he didn't take the thatch off but put an asbestos roof over the top of the thatch. After the war in 1945, the house was bought by Mr. Cherry, and Mr. Cherry decided to install an Aga cooker in the house and actually lined the chimney with 5-gallon drums. and over the course of time the drums rusted away, and the spark from the chimney ignited the thatch underneath the asbestos, and of course the asbestos all went up, and there it was banging and flying everywhere on the day the fire took place. But afterwards he once again lowered the roof and re-roofed it, but in due course it became derelict, and it became overgrown. All the front garden was overgrown, and the children, local children, they used to go into this house and they used to refer to it, as known to the youngsters, as a haunted house, because it was such a dilapidated place.
Moving north through the village, Boxworth End becomes Middlewatch. The first pub we come to went by the curious name of the 6 days only.
The 6 days only, called by some Middlewatch, was built in the 1840s by William Crisp. It was licensed by him under the 1830 Beer Act to sell homebrew beer. A board was fixed over the door stating the house was licensed to sell beer by retail. William was a strict Baptist and would not allow drinking to take place on a Sunday. The Crisp butcher's shop was built next to the house, but detached from it. The public house and butcher's shop probably closed shortly after William died in 1916. In the 1990s, the house and buildings were taken down, and the site is now a car park for the strict Baptist chapel.
The only other pub in the Middlewatch area was the Blue Bell Inn.
The Blue Bell Inn stood on the site of number 3436 Middlewatch. It was originally a thatched building, fully licensed in 1820. In 1866 the public house was burnt down. It suffered the fate of so many Swavesey thatched houses in the 19th century.
Thatch was extensively used for roofing, and fires were frequent in Swavesey. Was fire the reason for the loss of so many of our public houses?
Majority of instances when a public house burned down, they rebuilt it. In the case, the Black Bull, the Black Horse, they were burnt down and rebuilt. The Bell Inn was burnt down and rebuilt. But in lots of other instances where they were just ordinary cottages, the demand for houses wasn't, population had dropped considerably, and in lots of instances sites were never rebuilt.
Middlewatch eventually turns into the High Street as we arrive at the central part of the village with the church, marketplace and the remains of the medieval docks. Our first pub here is at number 27, the Rising Sun. It was a public house for over a century and closed within living memory in the 1960s. The living room at the front still retains a small bar, and this house probably gives us the best idea of what a lot of these small pubs were like inside.
There was seats all the way around the outside of the wall where people used to sit, and then there'd be the odd table in the room itself where they could sit and stand the pints of beer. The people using the pub would have been the people that lived in this area, because there were so many public houses through the village. People didn't have to walk very far to go to a public house, and no doubt they had their favourite ones where their friends used to go, and they used to congregate in those particular ones of an evening. It became a habit with a lot of them, and they'd got nowhere else to go. One of the last tenants was said to be related to the notorious Cray twins, the London gangsters. I've been told that they used to visit the Rising Sun when their relatives lived here.
The Rising Sun also featured a jug and bottle.
Jug and bottle was so that people who lived in the vicinity could come in with their jugs and be provided with a pint or 2 pints of beer, or they could come in and buy packets of crisps or cigarettes without actually coming into the bars or the lounge bar to be served.
One of the oldest pubs in this part of the village was the Black Horse, licensed in 1777 and still open in 1912. The present house was built after the original thatched building was burnt down. In 1980, an 1861 penny was found in the roof, probably placed there when the house was built. The original pub was probably built here because of the presence of a spring. This spring was the most important supply of water in Swavesey, and the story of the Swavesey pubs is closely linked with that of the drinking water.
The water supply that supplied the main part of the village came from the spring in the high street. There was a very good supply of water from that spring, and that was possible for them to pipe that through to Boxworth End. Not quite as far as the doctor's surgery, actually. At Boxworth End is where they managed to get the water to flow by gravity to that point, and they placed 5 pumps along that stretch. Well, it was all right for a while, but they were only clay pipes, and in the course of time the roots of the trees alongside the road grew into the pipes and used to block the pipes, and the supply to Boxworth End was quite often cut off. Not only was there 5 public pumps on this supply, there was also 18 other private supplies were taken off the same pipe.
This water supply presented additional serious problems. It was 1854 that the notable London physician John Snow first demonstrated that the cholera epidemic raging through London was being transmitted via the drinking water from a well. This ushered in a period of nationwide inspection of drinking water supplies for contamination.
Pumps in the village were continually being condemned and told as they were unfit to drink. Now, I think the reason why some of those 18 private supplies were getting contaminated is the fact that they were getting water into the supply from the surrounding probably farmyards or buildings where they were keeping livestock, so it was actually contaminating the supply.
The making of beer effectively killed the lethal contaminants in the water and made it safe to drink. The beer would usually be a weak brew and drunk mostly as a substitute for water, rather than for the alcohol content, and would be drunk by both adults and children. These weak beers were a staple of life for working families, and goes some way to accounting for the number of pubs in the 18th and 19th centuries.
This was probably the reason why, after the 1830 Beer Act, as it was, it increased the number of houses in the village that could open and sell beer, but they couldn't sell wine, spirits and things like that. You see, they were limited as to what they could sell. I think that's why we must have had an expansion, because of the easing of the regulations.
In 1830, the Beer House Act was passed. It was a radical piece of legislation affecting the selling of alcohol. Before this act, beer could only be sold by people holding a full licence.
You had to be of a certain standard, and you had to get backing from locals to say that you was of a good character and whatnot before you could actually get a licence in the first place. And they all had to be licensed by the justices of the peace, you see. You had to go in front of the justices and get your licence. By 1830, the Beer Act allowed householders assessed for the poor rate, so if your property was liable to pay the poor rate, then you could sell beer, ale and cider without a licence. They were the 3 things you could sell. But you couldn't sell spirits, see, because you had to have the proper licence for that. This probably accounts for the increase in the beer houses in villages, because there must have been quite an increase of beer houses in Swavesey between about 1830 through to about 1880, 1890.
The result of the Act was an explosion in the number of small pubs in Swavesey. It was said at this time that a man standing at the top of Market Street could throw a cricket ball into the yards of 8 different public houses. There was the Cricketers, now the Foxglove Shop, at number 56, from 1861 to 1895, the Sir Harry Smith at number 21. Sir Harry was a famous military commander in India in the 1840s. The King William IV was a common name for beer houses opened under the Beer Act, this being the monarch on the throne at the time. It was at number 8 in the High Street, but was not open for long. the Bird in the Hand at 1 Taylor's Lane was probably only open for a couple of decades. The Little Rose at number 1 closed in 1910. The Railway Tavern in Taylor's Lane closed in 1905. It is alleged that a spark from the chimney of this house started the great 1913 fire. Most of the beer houses did not stay open for long. By the beginning of the 20th century, many were closing. One reason for this was almost certainly an improvement in the quality of drinking water. But John thinks the main reason for this decline is because of the shrinking population of the village.
She getting quite close to the score. Break half novel was Alistair MacLean. And then Martin Litt. Okay, you do it, doesn't want mine. Oh, it's got to be uppy down, hasn't it? Yes! Yes, go on, Matty. Cash game! Hey! We should have taken that, shall we? Yeah, we should have taken it. What happens if you don't take the cash game? Do these values increase?
I don't know.
I love the way this doesn't matter. After you. Oh, to me, you go. I'll tell you, I'm going to echo you. Hey, 50p. Off we're up to £1. I told you I was going to copy you. I'd like to point out that I'm actually up before I know that. I'll go that diagonally now.
Worked up there as a breakfast. Couldn't show nobody.
Dad.
£2.
Well, we're quitting, mate.
We are.
We can collect it.
How much can you get?
Well, in theory, it's almost unlimited, the riches that could pour out of it.
You don't like Lunar, do you, mate?
I don't mind. You know me, I'm actually quite relaxed about this sort of thing.
No, we haven't got enough for a pint each. Do we have enough for a pint each?
We might have enough for a pint each.
Swavesey's depopulation was part of a national trend, driven by the decline in the domestic agricultural economy.
In 1880 we were starting to get the first boatloads of frozen meat coming in from Australia and New Zealand, frozen lamb, that was all coming in, competing against the locally produced stuff. Well, you couldn't produce against places like Australia with the vast areas they've got there for fattening cattle and fattening sheep and things. I mean, you know, it was, you know, so you got steamships who could bring stuff in, whereas in the 1850s you were still on sailing ships, you see, 1850s and 1860s.
By the outbreak of the Second World War, the population in the village had recovered. But much had changed by this time. Mains Water had arrived in 1912 and provided safe drinking water. The easing of licensing laws under the Beer Act had effectively been reversed, and Swavesey was no longer a small agricultural community. The conditions that fostered the proliferation of the village pubs had gone and were not to return. We move on to the last few pubs at the north end of the village, on Station Road. The first one we come to is the Bottle House.
The Bottle House, that was a thatch cottage, and that was one of the houses which could sell beer. They hadn't a licence to consume beer on the premises, and you sold for consumption off the premises. So it was called the Bottle House. It was burnt down in 1913, in the fire in 1913, and after the fire the house was rebuilt by my grandfather. In the end of the house there are 9 bottles in the shape of a diamond. The centre bottle is a special bottle. Now in that bottle is a little note which Grandfather Mitham wrote, which says, "This bottle was filled with ale, brewed by King Edward VII in 1892 at Lord Burton's brewery, Burton-on-Trent. This bottle was presented by Mr. John Smith, the Swan Inn, Swavesey, Cambs." And that note is still in the bottle. It is said, although I've never been able to see it, but they say that if the sun is shining on the bottle in the right position, you can still see the note in the bottle. But I think that's a bit of imagination on people's part. But that's Swan with Two Necks was another public house that was licensed in 1820. If you look at the building, you'll see part of the house is much earlier. It's built in 2 stages. Swan with Two Necks, as you'll notice, has a causeway in front of the house, and this was because at one time the Swan Pond was part of the dock system in the village, and barges would come into that part of the village and would draw alongside the house, alongside the causeway, and load and unload at that point. It's the reason why that particular house has probably got the large cellars, because it was used for storage of wines and spirits and whatnot in the cellars. The name, the Swan with Two Necks, probably dates back to the time of Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth was granted the right of ownership of certain swans to the Worshipful Company of Vintners, and to be able to identify these, 2 nicks were placed in the beaks of the swans, and this is probably where the name Swan with Two Necks came from. On occasions you will see it put down as Swan with Two Necks, but that is not the correct name. It's a misinterpretation of the word.
Number 18 Station Road was the Chequers. It is probably one of the oldest inn sites in the village and was built as a coaching inn. Robinson Mitham was the innkeeper in 1820.
From that time onwards, it was in the occupation of the Mitham family. Thomas Mitham and then Robinson Mitham, and then moved on to John Mitham. And John Mitham's wife, Lucy, she carried on the public house after John died. The story goes that on one occasion a man from Swavesey was on the way to Over to see, on business, to see somebody in Over, and he thought he'd call in at the Chequers public house and have a pint of beer before he continued on his way. Well, he came in and he sat and waited for this pint of beer to be brought up by Lucy from the cellar, and she was such a long time he decided he couldn't wait any longer. He went off to Over. Anyway, on the way back he thought, well, I'll call in again and see whether I can get a pint of beer in the Chequers. And as he went in, Lucy was just returning from the cellar with a pint of beer. The name the Chequers comes from the word exchequer. You had a checkered board on which you checked money in and money out, and that's where the name came from. Any public house which dealt in money lending or anything in that way was quite often named the Chequers, after the occupation, which was business that carried on in that particular public house.
We return to the heart of the village, in Market Street, for our last 2 hostelries.
The George and Dragon was another public house fully licensed in 1820, probably an early alehouse. The sign gets its origin from England's patron saint.
About 1908, Prime Godfrey took possession of the premises and started a business as a haulage contractor using steam engines and wagons. By 1946, Godfrey's was the second largest employer in the village.
For over 70 years, part of the public house was used as offices for the haulage business. It was sold off as a private house in the 1980s.
We finish our journey at the White Horse. It may well be the oldest pub in the village.
I still think this one and this one with 2 necks on the stones, as we call it, on the causeway. They were probably the two. They're probably the 2 oldest public houses in Swavesey. If I had to pick 2, I would put this one the oldest, and I'd put that one next. And I think the Chequers probably came in round about would have been round about that time, probably a little later. The White Horse was originally a wood-framed lath and plaster building, and it had been enlarged and extended over the years. The name probably dates from about 1700. A galloping white horse was the sign of the House of Hanover, and after George I became king in 1714, many inns adopted this sign in loyalty to the new royal household.
The White Horse has probably always been the most significant pub in Swavesey. This stems from its central position next to the medieval marketplace.
1240, I think I'm right in saying, is when the market charter was granted. It appears to have ran until about 1500. It was running over that period. Then it seems as though it began to peter out. I mean, if they've got a market here, I mean, obviously you're going to have somewhere for people to make it. I mean, it stands to reason. There must have been an inn in this area, and what better place than this side on this corner? It was ideally situated.
As well as gatherings of market traders, the White Horse became the place that other important village meetings were held.
In 1836, a public meeting to discuss the enclosure of the village was held in the White Horse. The principal landowners agreed to ask Parliament to pass an act to enclose the village. After it was passed, all official meetings were held in the White Horse. Property sales were mostly held in the White Horse, and after an accident or sudden death, the inquest was often held in the pub. One interesting bit of history that has survived, it is claimed that workmen, when they were restoring the church in 1867, found a stone coffin lid in the church and carried it up to the White Horse, where it was laid as the doorstep. Philip Dodson, the innkeeper at the time, paid the workmen for it in beer.
The White Horse has undergone quite a lot of changes in its long history.
The original part of the White Horse is in actual fact the frontage onto Market Street, which is basically what is now the public bar, and about less than a quarter of the lounge bar. In actual fact, up until the late 50s, what now constitutes the public bar comprised of 4 separate bars. We had a public bar, there was a snug, there was a smoke room and a tap room. This is fairly evident in the White Horse. When you look at the gable end, you can actually see how the height of the roof has actually been increased. I would imagine at the time that they probably increased the height of the room, quite possibly for more living accommodation up in what would now be the roof void. The part of the bar that I'm standing in now was in actual fact the parlour. Was the parlour for the landlord, who knows in the original days would have been the late great Cyril Lever, who was here for 22 years. And this part of the bar was his front room.
The White Horse is now the last survivor of at least 24 public houses from the last 300 years. Whitbreads purchased the pub in the mid-50s. What does the future hold?
Whitbreads, being a brewer, actually had an interest in the product. They had an interest in the people that sold the product for them, and as a brewer they had an interest in the public, the people that bought the product. Unfortunately then, in the early 80s, Maggie Thatcher introduced what became known as the beer orders, which was effectively trying to cut down on the monopoly of brewers. There became law that brewers could not own more than 2,000 pubs, which led to the advent of what we now know as the pub company. We had 2 major pub companies, namely Enterprise and Punch. It was Enterprise Inns that purchased the freehold of the White Horse Inn from Whitbreads, and from then on we got a downward spiral. The pub companies, they are basically property companies that use the pub trade to service their debt. 2 years ago, 52 pubs a week were closing. 52 a week, I mean that is 7 pubs a day closing. It's an awful lot. Structurally, certainly in the last 6 years it's fallen to pieces because unfortunately there's no money left after paying the rent and everything else, and and you're getting no joy out of a pub company who have owned the premises for 9 years and haven't spent one penny on it.